Hello and welcome back to Section 2 of Chapter 10.2, Medical Professionals. This is a summary that goes with the Transgender Ideology and Gender Dysphoria, a Catholic Response book. Again, the copy of the book is found below if you'd like to follow along. You might want to see at least Part 1 if you haven't seen Part 1. This deals more with the medical evidence in terms of negative health outcomes from sex reassignment surgery and hormone replacements. So hopefully you'll find this interesting. One of the hot button issues about health outcomes for sex reassignment surgery is the suicide rates, right? Everyone's pretty aware of the suicide issue with the transgender issue. Now, problem is there's very high suicide attempts and rates of suicide, both before and after sex reassignment surgery. That's one of the issues here. In a 2015 American study found that 92% of transgender individuals reported attempting suicide before 25 years of age. Right? So very high rate. When we look at the general population of the same age group, you have 6.4% heterosexual high school age students. These, again, attempts, not necessarily successful. And 29.4% LGB, right, gay, lesbian, bisexual attempt rates. This is from studies from 2016. So to say that even lesbian, gay, bisexual are at nearly 30%, but transgender is 3 times higher than the other highest is very high, right? These suicide rates are even higher, but most closely associated with people with dissociative identity disorders, which is 70% suicide rate. I think the only other suicide rate that's as high as this would be people who were in concentration camps in Nazi Germany, right? And there's absolutely no hope and absolute despair in the concentration camps. There are high rates of suicide attempts. So this is just an unprecedented level of suicide attempts. Now, when we look at, again, medical outcomes, this can be very controversial, and there's a liberal perspective and a conservative perspective. If you don't know where I stand, I come at it from a Catholic perspective, which is biological realism. Let's just look at the data and try not to use ideologies to guide us. Let's look at what it actually says. Would be nice. In 2016, Obama administration had to decide whether or not that Medicare or Medicaid would cover sex reassignment surgeries, right? And this is at the end of his 8-year presidency. If you recall back from President Obama, at the beginning of his presidency, he was not in favor of same-sex marriages. By the end, he was fully in favor of same-sex marriages. He went from fairly moderate at the beginning of his presidency to far more progressive towards the end of his presidency, somewhat of a result of society changing in that 8-year period of time. Maybe some part of it is that he's not seeking re-election, so he can give maybe a more honest answer of how he really felt. But they were in the final year of his presidency, can't run again, and he's faced with this, whether or not the Medicare, Medicaid is going to cover sex reassignment surgeries. So he, to his great credit, he uses great researchers, and he says to them, tell me, get from me the best information, find the results. And now they look at, this is Jensen, Chin, it's a whole team of them. They look at every study that's available as of 2016, and they go through all of it, and they say, well, this one is very small sample size, and this one, we don't know about the approach with this one. They look at all of it in great detail and try to come up with a synthesis of, well, what is the conclusions? What is the ultimate conclusion of all of these medical studies combined, right? We're going to look at everything. And a big one is the Digion Study from Sweden 2011. That's a very influential study. But it's not all. He looks at all of them. So there's first a letter of, they do their research and they present it, right? So that's the first letter. The same year comes up with the final decision, which comes with another letter. They're very similar. The recommendation and the final ruling is, they're just built on, it's the same reasoning, right? He uses the reasoning of his experts to come to his conclusion. So there's a lot of similarities. They wrote, this is their conclusion after looking at every study again, based on a thorough review of the clinical evidence available at the time of 2016, there is not enough evidence to determine whether gender reassignment surgery improves health outcomes for Medicare beneficiaries with gender dysphoria. There were conflicting, inconsistent study results of the best designed studies. Some reported benefits while others reported harms. The evidence's quality and strength were low due to mostly observational study designs with no comparison groups, potential confounding, and small sample sizes. Many studies that report positive outcomes were exploratory type studies, class series, case control, with no confirmatory follow-up. This is the final conclusion. This is what's been proposed, and Obama uses it as his final conclusion, really. You look at all of the evidence, what do you get? Inconclusive. The results are inconclusive. And in some ways, perhaps even harmful, right? And the most important study in here is the Digion Study. Now, the Digion Study is the Swedish study, 2011. Right, there's another one, 2013, looking at all of the data in Sweden. There's no loss to follow-up, as I pointed out in part 1 of this, right? You can lie with numbers, right? If you say 610 people have received surgeries from Germany, and 75% of them say that they're happy, but 75% of people didn't even respond. So you're not really getting 75% of people who are happy. So you could either, again, as a result, say, well, 74% success rate. Or you could look at it, include the people who didn't respond in the negative and say, well, 21% success rate. Well, how do you come to any determination if your success rate is anywhere between 21 and 74%? Right? This is not specific enough to, if you say between 70 and 75%, okay, yeah, that's successful fairly, but 21 to 74, it's too wide of a range. So because of this, if you're looking at objective criteria, objective measures, not do you feel happier now or happier before? What problem with that? People can lie, and you're talking about feelings. People can even deceive themselves, right? You don't always know. People say they're happy until the day before they kill themselves. So you can't always depend on subjective criteria. Now, Digion Study looks at objective criteria. Strokes, heart attacks, cancer, hospitalizations after suicide attempts, mental health, hospitalizations, right? These are objective criteria. They are not up to opinion. They don't care about your feelings, right? And because Sweden has a national healthcare system, this is for the entire country and over long periods of time, right? For several decades. So looking at objective criteria over several decades with no loss to follow up, we have the best information we can get, right? And Sweden is also a very liberal society, so we can't, it's probably not a conservative bias here, right? There's not the same shame and guilt that you could say is in the United States, for example. When we look at this chart, this is from the Digion Study, this black line and the gray line, black line male, gray line female, these are deaths, right, of people who are both transgender and non-transgender, right? So in this chart, so starting at the point of the surgery, right, So for every person that they used who was transgender, they took a control group of somebody around the same age who's not transgender, right? So you're dealing with identical groups of people from the same culture. Just one's transgender, one's not, right? That's the only factor. If you look at death rates, right, you can see men in general die more than women, right? So men have lower success rates in terms of living. Women do better. But when we look at transgender, you can see there's a pretty strong divide, right? If you look at the black dotted line for males who identify as females, it's you've lost a significant percentage of your study, right? They died, right? There's a clear difference with death rate of non-transgender versus transgender, right? And an even greater loss from females, right? Because cis women, natal women, non-transgender women, right? They live even longer, right? They have even less of a death rate, but they have the same death rate as transgender male to female, right? So not good, right? And this isn't looking at the cause, right? Why? It's just saying, 25 years, 30 years later, are you dead or alive, right? And for people who have had transgender sex reassignment surgeries, they are significantly more dead as a group, right? There's significantly more people from the transgender group who've died than people who are not in the transgender group 10, 20, 30 years after surgeries, right? If you look at the first 10 years, it's not that much of a difference. It's after the 10-year mark that death starts. It's almost a complete drop for men, right? It's a big drop. And for women, it's more in the 20 to 30 year mark, 25 year to 30 year mark. So something's happening. What's happening to them after 10 years? What's happening after 25 years for women, right? Well, things like it could be suicide, right? It could be. But things like cancers as well. Cancer, heart attacks, strokes, other health-related issues are leading to a faster demise, right? So if you're going to be more likely to get cancer, that's not going to happen probably in the first 5 years. But in the long term, right, when you're at a higher rate of cancer, that's bad, right? It's going to lead to more mortality, right? A higher mortality rate, heart attacks, strokes, all these other things, right? This is also from the Digion Study. The column to the right is a control group, right? The non-transgender people, and the outcomes on the left is for the transgender group. So suicide rates, you can see, is 7.9 times higher than the control group. If you look at things like psychiatric hospitalization, and for issues not related to the gender identity, is considerably higher, right? If you look at it, the hospitalization for mental health issues was 4.5 times higher than the general population, 10 to 15 years out. And suicide attempts are 7.9 times higher. Substance abuse was 3.3 times higher. And involvement in crime was also higher, right? Heart disease is over 2-3 times higher, right? So just much higher death rate as a result of all of these treatments, right? So why is this? Well, some of it's, the female body having high levels of testosterone has an effect. The male body having high levels of estrogen has an effect. Bodies were not made for these chemicals at these rates, right? Men still have estrogen, men and females still have testosterone, but not at these rates, right? The bodies were not designed for this. Other things deal with that there was an underlying mental health issue, right? An underlying issue that was not dealt with the surgery, right? The psychiatric hospitalization and the suicide isn't a result of the hormones. It's a result of not treating the underlying issue, right? It didn't solve the problem. Other statistics also show that diabetes rates are much higher, right? twice as high for transgender people than general population, right? And often diabetes goes along with being overweight, which makes sense since 40% of transgender people are diagnosed obese, whereas only 24.6% of cisgender people. Now, these are American statistics, right? So, transgender people nearly, as Americans were already obese, they're nearly twice as obese, right? So, that's an issue. Other issues, Dr. Cretella, sorry I don't have his first name, you can look back to the book for it, says these medications arrest bone growth, decrease bone accretion, prevent sex steroid development, organization, and maturation of adolescent brains, and inhibit fertility, right? Some of these are somewhat desired, right? The infertility, but bone density and things like this is a serious health side effect, right? Other side effects of testosterone therapy include development of polycystic diphlimidia. It increases cardiovascular risk, right, for heart attacks, and endometrial hyperplasia. Right? I've looked these up, and they're serious, but I can't explain them. They're a bit much. 41% of transgender people report attempting suicide compared to only 1.6% of the general population, with rates that rising to 55% for those who lost a job or other circumstantial things, right? People being mean to you or bullying, right? It increases significantly, right? So very high rates, bad mental health issues is combined with adding other negative effects of cross-sex hormones. Now, if we were to look at, well, what then is the advice, right? So we already know what gender activists, we already know that they have convinced a lot of the medical community to run with this, but what would gender realists say, people in the field? So people like Kenneth Zucker, Ray Blanchard, J. Michael Bailey, these are people from the Toronto School, Anne Lawrence, Deborah Zoe, Abigail Schreier. She's a journalist, not a scientist. The other ones are all scientists. They would point to this idea. Here's what I wrote in my book. They claim that some people with early-onset gender dysphoria benefit tremendously from a medical approach to help socially transition their gender identity. These professionals are fully aware of the risks of transitioning, but their experience with gender dysphoria has convinced them that this is the best approach for some people, right? And the key being some people. So, some of them would even say late onset gender dysphoria would be fine too, or something like this, right? This is a generalized agreement, I think, among most of them, of what would they say at least? At least they would say, for some people, transitioning, although can never change somebody really biologically, you can have a social transformation. It can be beneficial for some people, right? That's basic, right? That's what they're saying, right? Some people, this is the best option. Not for everyone, probably not even for most, right? This is the best advice from gender realists, right? The theologian, philosopher, E. Christian Bruggers, who I think he writes very well and very smart. He's a seminary professor at St. Vincent de Paul Seminary, I think very moderate and agreeable. He similarly claims that sex reassignment surgery should be allowed in a minimal capacity. He argues that medical professionals must be reasonably convinced that a specific patient could never find psychological peace aside for surgery. That is, it would have to be a last resort. They would have to be truthful that whatever is going on is not a sex change or gender change, but a gravely disfiguring surgical procedure aimed at realizing whatever psychic stability is possible in this life. Right? I think that is a very reasonable and moderate approach, to be honest. Right? I think, because what it makes very clear is, we can't jump onto the ideological part of this of, well, you're born a man, but you're really a woman, so we're going to turn you into a woman. Well, you are what you are. You can't change you into a different sex. That's not possible. But if your psychological state is so disordered and so unbalanced, and the only thing that would give you peace would be to have this surgery, recognizing that it's gravely disfiguring, if this is the only thing that will ever give you peace in this life, then as a last resort, maybe, right? I think we take this approach with BIID, where this idea of, should we remove a healthy arm, for example? There are some doctors who would, right? And it's like, if this is the only thing that will make you happy, your whole life is obsessed over this one thing, the only thing that will ever give you peace is to remove the arm, then maybe, right? Maybe. We're not going to call it normal. We're not going to call it healthy. We're not going to say, yeah, you were right. You were wrong. This is all very confusing. It's not healthy. But if this is the only thing that's going to give you any sense of peace, okay, right? Possible. So I think that's it's not a very positive perspective. It's not a very optimistic perspective, but I think it's a fair moderate one, right? Some people. Now, looking at, what do people think, right? I think Harry Benjamin, he's kind of held the line from the beginning, right? This is 1966. And his approach, and I don't think, Harry Benjamin was a very well-intentioned doctor and I think fairly competent. I don't, Dr. Money you can question, but Dr. Harry Benjamin, I think he had a big heart for transgender people and he tried his best. He said after a result of 20 years of trying to help transgender people, he says, psychotherapy, which aims at curing transsexualism so that the patient will accept himself as a man, it must be repeated here. It is a useless undertaking with presently available methods. The mind of a transsexual cannot be changed in its gender orientation. Right? This is his conclusion of 20 years of working with transgender people. He also says, since it is evident that the mind of the transsexual cannot be adjusted to the body, it is logical and justifiable to attempt the opposite, to adjust the body to the mind. If such a thought is rejected, it would be faced with a therapeutic nihilism to which I could never subscribe because of the experience I have had with patients who are unable, who have undoubtedly been salvaged or at least distinctly helped by their conversion. Right? His idea is that we've tried to change the mind. We cannot change the mind. Now, he is not a psychiatrist, so there's not much he could do with that. He's an endocrinologist, so it's dealing with the... So he's looking in the world through the lens of an endocrinologist. But his view is that we've tried it. If we could just change the mind, that would be easier. That would be better. But we don't have any methods to do this. So if they said, if we're left with nothing, right? If the psychology doesn't work and we offer them nothing, it's kind of a nihilism, right? There's no hope for them. This is the only hope they have. And as insufficient as it is better than... It's better than nothing, right? That's what he's saying. And this approach has become the approach moving forward, although now it's seen as, a great option. Even Dr. Benjamin says it's not a great option, it's just the only option. Doctors Teraway and Bars, medical doctors, Dutch, good Catholics, I think they offer an alternative, right, or an area for the church to get involved in this area, and that is, and I think that this is very important for people in the churches to hear, right, especially conservatives to hear. They point out terms of psychological healing. It says no one should proceed on their own, neither in the matter of diagnosing one's own illness or applying our therapeutic directives. Of even greater danger, especially in the charismatic renewal and Pentecostal circles, it is popular practice of inner healing by minimally qualified persons. They may possess the necessary faith and goodwill towards their neurotic brothers and sisters in Christ, but too many are either similarly affected without realizing it or lack the professional knowledge necessary to effectively help severely afflicted neurotic patients, short of rarely occurring instantaneous cure, right? It is not the job of the church or pastors, bishops, school administrators to get involved in trying to be psychologists, trying to cure somebody's gender dysphoria, right? Unless you are clinically trained to deal with a psychological disorder or this field, this is not for you to get involved with, right? It doesn't mean you're not well-intentioned. It just means you should not be getting involved in it, right? And the Williams Institute found LGBT individuals who underwent religious counseling were more likely than those who received no therapy to commit suicide, right? The consequence of doing this wrong is detrimental, right? And what Tara William Bars also point out is even professionals who have been doing this for their life do not get it right all the time. So people who are untrained in this should definitely not get involved in trying to do conversion therapy for transgender people. The best approach, okay, you have Harry Benjamin, who says all we got is the medical approach to transitioning because you can't change the mind. You got religious people who say you can change the mind, it might be a spiritual ailment. The Catholic approach, the better approach, would be the Turways and Barr's approach, which is said a Christian psychiatrist, preferably, but not necessarily, one who is accustomed to praying with his patients. They advise one which has the full approval of the spiritual director, since it can shed any doubts which otherwise have been impeded, if not impossible for the healing process, right? The best approach is to have a good Catholic spiritual therapist, right? One who knows psychology and also understands Catholic philosophy and theology, right? One who's willing to pray. Now, why, right? This is just a conservative approach. Why? Well, because sciences, particularly psychiatry, often are approaching an issue as atheist, right? They're often approaching this from a clinical perspective, and the average person they're dealing with is not an atheist, right? So if the average person has some belief in God, even people who claim agnosticism, or even some people who claim to be atheists, they have some spirituality that's within them. And if you don't, and that can be very helpful to help heal a person, right? It's not, let's say a person had cancer. It's not that the faith heals the cancer, but if a doctor can integrate faith into the healing process, it can improve the outcomes for the cancer treatment, right? People live longer in hospice care than outside of hospice care, given that they're dying, right? They live longer. Why? Because hospice care deals with the person, right? It deals with, is there anything that you could need spiritually, music, food, art, right? It's dealing with quality of life, not the clinical. People have better outcomes, right? So when you can integrate the humanities into healing and not just treat it as science on one side, humanities on the other, but have an integrated approach to healing that involves spirituality is better, right? So the transgender issue would do better with, if there's some type of medical treatment, to include in it spirituality, include in it people's faith, right? It can help can have better outcomes. Even the book of Sirach, I'll just give a summary of it, but he says, son, first pray, right? Pray first. God has given us, God wants us to pray, but then go to the doctors. God has given us the doctors. He's given us the pharmacists. He's given us the herbs to heal us, right? So find a good prayerful doctor, and science and faith go hand in hand within the book of Sirach, and I think that's a good example that we have here. And lastly, Pope Francis, when he's asked about some of these medical issues with transgender, he points out, he always says things in a kind of funny way, but tendencies, hormonal imbalance, have and cause so many problems. We must be attentive, not to say that it's all the same, but in each case, welcome, accompany, study, discern, and integrate. This is what Jesus would do today. Very Pope Francis, right? These are complicated issues, right? If we can try to integrate the human person, it's going to be better than siloing them, right? Or just medicalizing them. An integrated approach would be best, right? So again, it's just medicalize, and then there's just the faith, and the Catholic approach is right down the middle, right? There's got to be a middle ground that's rooted in solid theology and philosophy, right? But it requires good medical care, right? And back to Archbishop Carlson's call, we want good and faithful medical professionals to integrate their faith into their treatment programs, right? The goal is not an atheistic approach, but an integrated approach. Okay, so next we will move on to other issues concerning nature and a least invasive approach. So that's it for now.